So I've been doing a little study on the gap theory, and I was providing evidence that this theory is actually a fact. But then I realized that perhaps the starting point should be to define what is the gap theory of Genesis chapter 1. So I went online and I searched some, some articles, etc., that speak on this subject, and to understand what people who are aware of this theory are teaching about it. So I found one on this blueletterbible.org, and it is by some gentleman named Don Stewart. And I'm going to read from it to help us understand what is the gap theory, and then I will add some of my own comments on it. And once we have understood what the gap theory is, then we will continue to present evidence to either prove it or to disprove it. So I found this article on the gap theory on blueletterbible.org by Don Stewart, and it provides a good explanation of this theory. I have added some comments which are in italics to the author's explanation. This is a PDF that I can include in the description, and those who are interested, they can read it. So in those, you will find that, in bold italics are my comments. They are not the writing of this author. In this article, the author tries to teach that the gap theory of Genesis reconciles the Bible with the findings of science. But as believers in Christ Jesus, we ought not to concern ourselves with the findings of so-called science. The age of creation is whatever it is. It does not have to reconcile with science. Secondly, we should not concern ourselves with conclusions based on discovery of such things as so-called fossils. There is way too much fraud and deception in this field to be concerned about dinosaur fossils or any other fossils, as a matter of fact. Okay, I will try and link a video in the description about this fraud, especially in the 19th century, that's been perpetrated. And when people go to see these skeletons of dinosaurs, etc., in museums, they think that, those are based on discoveries of bones. No, they really are not. Okay, there's a whole level of fraud in it, which most people, would find shocking, and they won't even believe it. But that is the reality, because this world is run by the God of this world, whose name is Satan, who is the father of lies. And as the so-called science has plenty of these lies in it. So we shouldn't be concerned about, what science is teaching. We should just study the Bible and understand what God is teaching. So science needs to reconcile with the Bible, not the other way around. So the reason for a believer to accurately understand the age of creation, to understand Bible history accurately, is the real history is his story. That is, it is the story of God. History brings us the knowledge of God. Therefore, we should do deep studies in the Word of God and divide it rightly, and we should not worry about what unbelieving so-called science might be teaching. People who try and reconcile the Bible and so-called science are subtly deceiving believers into accepting the theories and conclusions based on such theories as accurate. But this is far from the truth. The instructor of the world's so-called science is the god of this world, Satan, and there is deception in any subject whose author is the father of lies, and that includes the field of most sciences, so-called, especially in geology, in history, in physics, etc. So in astronomy and these things, there's plenty of lies and fraud in it, and we can't go down that rabbit hole right now. So let's continue our study. Real history is Bible history, and if it is in the Bible, then God has had this history written down for our edification. That is to build up our faith in Him, not just for the purposes of curiosity. I mean, it's really, I would say, emancipating. It frees the mind when you begin to understand real history, but it frees it even more. Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And this making free is a process. We begin by understanding a little bit of the truth, but the more we begin to understand it, is like the blinders that keep coming off our eyes, and the more everything begins to make sense. God's creation begins to make sense. The presence of evil in this world begins to make sense. The presence of death. All these pain, these things begin to make sense. And they're all related to history as to what has happened, but more importantly, why it has happened. So if the gap theory is in reality a fact, then we need evidence from the Bible, not from so-called science, to prove that in reality, creation is much older than is generally taught in the so-called church, that it is only about 6,000 years old. So let's continue on to this article by Dan Stewart from the blueletterbible.org, and let's see how he explains this gap theory. So one of the most popular ways of understanding the creation account in Genesis is known as the gap theory, or the ruin and reconstruction theory, which is actually a good description, that it is the ruin and reconstruction theory. I would not say, okay, he says one of the most popular ways the author wrote. So here's my comment on that. I would not say that this is one of the most popular ways of understanding the creation account, for most Christians do not even know that there is a gap theory of creation at all. Continuing with the author's explanation. Although there are some variations among those who hold the gap theory, his basic teachings are as follows. First, perfection, then chaos. Genesis 1:1 refers to God's initial perfect creation. Everything that God made was beautiful. There was no sin anywhere. And my comment to that is that this is logical, because evil did not exist in the beginning of creation. And since sin is a product of an evil nature, so evil has to come first. So evil has a beginning in God's creation. It wasn't present in God's creation from the beginning. Evil has a beginning. It did not exist from the beginning. Therefore, sin did not exist in the beginning of creation. So what this person wrote, that, everything that God made was beautiful, there was no sin anywhere, I would agree with it. Verse 2, on the other hand, assumes, continuing with the author's article, verse 2, on the other hand, assumes that a great catastrophe occurred that caused the earth to become in a chaotic state through the judgment of God. According to the gap theory, the formless and void state, as recorded in Genesis 1, verse 2, is in direct contrast to the perfect initial creation. Something happened between the first two verses of Genesis to cause the earth to become desolate and uninhabitable after having been originally made in a perfect state. So here's my comment again. Whatever might have happened in the gap of time between the first two verses of Genesis is the basis for the gap theory. That's why it's called the gap, because this arrival of evil and this ruin and destruction, it only fits into the gap that we find between verse 1 and verse 2, which is the basis for the gap theory. Those holding the gap theory contend that this state of ruin could have possibly lasted millions of years, and that's the author's words. And again, the period of time that it might have lasted, it could have been tens of thousands of years, at least, I would think, or it could have been millions and possibly even billions of years. We have no idea about how long this gap is, just that there is a gap, or so it seems. So then, reconstruction. After this unknown amount of time, that is, some type of judgment was passed upon that creation, after this unknown amount of time, which we call the gap, between the first two verses, God began a recreation or restitution. And I, inserted in this restitution a replenishment, because you read about that in the Bible, which involves successive days. This is the author's article continued. The remainder of the first chapter of Genesis deals with the reconstruction of the earth, not the original creation. The recreation is usually assumed to have occurred only a few thousand years ago and was accomplished in 6 literal 24-hour days. Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 to Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, therefore, is a second creation. Consequently, Genesis speaks of creation, judgment, ruin, and recreation in just the first two verses. This is my comment. This is up to that point. Genesis speaks of creation, judgment, ruin, and recreation. Is that Don Stewart, the author's words? And I would say yes, that if there was some type of judgment and a recreation had to be restarted in verse 3, then that original creation, the judgment of that creation, and the ruin of that creation, it fits into that gap between verse 1 and verse 2. So if this understanding, these are my words, if this understanding of creation history as a lengthy process that has progressed over several ages is true, then we need to know what the real history of creation is, what has happened in the past, but more importantly, why it has happened. History has a purpose, as everything that God does have a purpose. The purpose of studying history is to understand the purposes of God revealed through history, the ultimate revelation being that God is love. So then these were my words that I just spoke. Now, continuing with the article, there's a heading, says literal days, old earth. The individuals who hold to the gap theory want to accept the Bible literally, as well as the conclusions of modern science about the ancient age of the earth. They are not evolutionists. Okay, so these are my comments to this past contention of this author, that that the reason for the gap theory is to try and reconcile the Bible and science. I wouldn't put much stock in theories and conclusions of modern science, such as the theory of evolution. Our primary concern is what the Bible teaches, whether it aligns with so-called science or not. So in this study, we are going to forget about what science teaches. We're only going to concentrate on what the Bible teaches. The gap theory, continuing with the author's article, the gap theory provides a solution to two problems between the Bible and science: the time problem and the fossil problem. And here again is my commentary on that. A little bit of study, especially in the subject of dinosaur fossils, will quickly prove that there is a great deal of deception and fraud in the discovery of fossils and the reconstruction that follows from such fossils. Therefore, it is ill-advised to put any faith whatsoever in the findings of so-called science through the discovery of dinosaur fossils, etc. And continuing with the article, to reconcile the Bible and science, the geological ages are placed between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. The reason to study the gap theory, and this is my observation, the reason to study the gap theory is not to reconcile the Bible and science, but to understand the true history of creation as taught in God's Word. So continuing with the author's article is the heading, what was the judgment? The judgment is usually spoken of as a flood, because the statement of Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, the earth was covered by water. Okay, it tells us darkness was upon the face of the deep. And then God later on continued to separate the waters that were on the surface, and he placed some of them above the firmament that he made between the earth and heaven, and some were left on the earth itself. This judgment is also known as the Luciferic flood, named after the angel who became the devil. Okay, now this is what the author had written. Now I will tell you my comments on what I think about this contention that this is the Luciferic flood and it's named after the angel who became the devil. I've taught in detailed studies in the past that Lucifer was not a fallen angel. The first angelic being who was the father of evil, and you could say the first fallen angel, was the anointed cherub of Ezekiel chapter 28. As we continue this study, it will become apparent that one of the main pieces of evidence for the gap theory, that there are long ages of history that fit in the gap between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, is related to the history of evil as to when it first entered God's creation and through whom, and how it matured and grew to full age over some long ages of time under three prominent creatures: the anointed cherub of Ezekiel 28, Lucifer of Isaiah 14, and finally came to full age in the devil who we know today as Satan. These three are not one and the same, as taught in many detailed studies, especially in my 15-part study on the history of evil in the Bible, which I've linked in the description. Finally, the author tells us the cause. Okay, the cause for the judgment is usually given as rebellion of Satan or some pre-Adamic race that sinned. All of the inhabitants of the earth were judged by God, leaving behind fossil remains. I don't know why this gentleman, keeps talking about fossils. They got nothing to do with it. Okay, if there was an evil world that existed back in that day and it was judged by God, that's all we need to concern ourselves with. All of the inhabitants of the earth were judged by God, leaving behind fossil remains. The present plants and animals living today have no genetic relationship with the fossils left behind by the judgment of God. So to summarize the gap theory, number one, Genesis 1:1 is the account of a perfect light-filled creation without darkness, evil, or sin. Both the heaven, the city of God, and the earth were created and formed and also inhabited by various creatures of spirit, such as angels, and of flesh. These are the pre-Adamic men called sons of God in the Bible. And number two, the original perfect creation began to decay and corrupt due to the birth of evil in creation, first through a high order of angelic beings, the cherubim, led by the anointed cherub, and later by other creatures such as Lucifer. And finally, evil became absolute in Satan, the present-day head of evil called the devil. This evolution of evil from its beginning as a seed in the heart of the anointed cherub to a full-grown tree in Satan occurred in that gap of time that fits between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. So the history of evil from its birth as a mere seed to full maturity as absolute darkness fits into the gap of time, which could have lasted many ages, spanning millions of years between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Number 3, in due time God judged and destroyed that old creation which had been contaminated by evil to the fullest, leaving behind the earth and the heavens above in a state of a ruined wasteland, flooded from the surface of the earth up into the heavens, a flood of much greater magnitude than Noah's flood. Though often called Lucifer's flood, I would like to call it Satan's flood, which will be studied in greater detail as this study progresses. In the beginning of the article on the gap theory, the author wrote it or called it also that he said that it is also known as the ruin and reconstruction theory. While somewhat accurate, I would reword the gap theory as follows. It is a theory of construction, followed by destruction of creation, followed by a reconstruction of creation theory. So this has been a brief explanation of the gap theory. In future segments, we will examine the evidence from the Bible to prove or to disprove this theory of creation.
One day you may wake up and wonder if there's worth to all this time and effort that you're spending on this earth. And if you are seeking with an honest heart, you'll find there's really only one way that can give you peace of mind. That's Jesus, Son of the living God. Blossoms from his flower of peace, sons of the living God. Freedom is the answer, all the paths have all been trod. Blueprint plans have all been laid by the Son of the living God. The buildings are in heaven, away from rot and rust. They're waiting there to house your souls, they're being built on trust.